Here are 5 fantasy football bold predictions for week 4 of the NFL season. Let's get right into it. Number 1, Saquon Barkley goes for over 200 combined rushing and receiving yards in week 4 against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Eagles are road favorites in Tampa Bay this week, which I get. They're coming off a quality win against New Orleans, put up over 450 yards of total offense in that game. Tampa, of course, got shellacked by the Denver Broncos at home last week. Both of these teams have injuries, though, and the Eagles, to me, are in danger of being critically banged up on this offensive side of the ball. Decent chance both A.J. Brown and Devontae Smith are out this week. They haven't really been able to get anyone else involved in that receiving core. Jahan Dotson, he's playing a lot of snaps. He's running a lot of routes. He's just kind of running around out there. Hasn't really been overly involved. We saw a lot of Britton Covey in week 2. He's now on IR as well. What this adds up to is if the Eagles are going to win this game, it's going to have to be through Saquon Barkley. Barkley accounted for both touchdowns last week against New Orleans, including that 65-yarder that finally took the lid off of the Eagles' offense. Meanwhile, Tampa Bay, they're down some key pieces in the secondary on defense, and they could again be without Vita Vea this week. He is on the short list of defensive tackles who really, really matter in the NFL. We saw it last week. Without Vita Vea, even the Denver Broncos, of all teams, were able to run on Tampa Bay. Tyler Beatty, for crying out loud, was ripping off over 8 yards per carry. If Brown and Smith are out, I think the Eagles have no choice but to turn this game over to Saquon Barkley, and perhaps to a lesser degree, Jalen Hurts. Saquon's already seeing over 20 carries per game. Teams know it's coming. They can't stop it. He's still ripping off almost 120 yards per game on the ground. I also think they can get him more involved in the passing game. I know he's had drop issues, but this is the week to do it. Tampa Bay, coming into week 4, has allowed the most receptions, the most yards, and the second most yards per target to running backs so far this season. Saquon Barkley goes for over 200 yards from scrimmage in week 4. Number 2, we're going with something a little less positive here. This is Deshaun Watson's final game as the Cleveland Browns starting quarterback. And look, I think it's a perfect storm, right? You're playing the Raiders. They're terrible. They're coming off of this unconscionable loss to the Carolina Panthers. They're thinking about benching Gardner Minshew. Then they say, no, all right, we're going to stick with Gardner Minshew for the week. The Raiders are a mess. If you lose this game after losing to the Giants, I think it's rock bottom for the Cleveland Browns. Their season is completely off the rails if they lose this game. It already might be off the rails. They already lost one of the easiest games on their schedule last week. They were very lucky to beat a Jaguars team that might be even worse than the Browns in week 2. At some point, Cleveland needs to stop the bleeding here. And I know injuries are a big part of their struggles. The offensive line has been decimated. They might be without 3 offensive line starters again this week. But Deshaun Watson's doing nothing to help the situation. He's off to one of the worst starts to a season for any Browns quarterback in the last 25 years. Just think about what that means. Think about the jersey with all the names written and taped over all the Browns quarterbacks for the last 25 years. Watson has been as bad as any of them. And part of the sell with Deshaun Watson, when you made that trade, grabbing him from Houston, was that he's the type of guy that can raise the tide. You know, when you don't necessarily have the best talent around him, he's the type of quarterback that can make up for that. Cleveland is dead last in offensive EPA. They're dead last in passing EPA. They're dead last in net yards per attempt. They're 30th in total passing yardage. This is just not a good aerial attack right now. It's not even close. And something has to give, right? If the Browns want to salvage this season, I think you got to bring in Jameis Winston. You brought him to this roster over the summer for a reason, partially due to injury risk for Deshaun Watson, but partially to prepare for this exact situation in which Deshaun Watson is not the guy that you thought he could be. And look, I've been on this for a while. I don't think he's getting it back. We're to the point now in Cleveland, he's never just going to zap back to being the guy that he was in Houston. It's not happening. I mean, at best, you know, you're just hoping he becomes a league average starter, and that's not what you thought you were getting in Deshaun Watson. If the Browns lose to the Raiders this week, which I think is a very real possibility, especially with that Cleveland injury report, I think we could see Jameis Winston out there in week 5 against Washington. I think there's going to be a lot of calls from it internally. I think there's going to be a lot of calls for that from the Browns fan base. And by the way, keep an eye on Anthony Richardson in Indy as well. I'm not saying they're giving up on him. I'm not saying they're going to bench him, but if Richardson turns it over 2 or 3 times again this week, you can bet there's going to be some calls for Joe Flacco. Before we get to our next bold prediction, quick reminder to please give us a like. Please subscribe to the RotoWire YouTube channel. If you're enjoying our videos, make sure you hit that subscribe button so you don't miss anything the rest of the NFL season. All right, number 3 on the list. This is the week 4, that Bucky Iriving officially overtakes Rachaad White in the Tampa Bay backfield. And look, maybe this isn't even all that bold because it feels like it's been trending that way increasingly over the last couple of weeks. It really goes back to the preseason where Todd Bowles was showering praise on Bucky Irving. But, you know, so far, White has continued to outsnap Irving through 3 weeks. It hasn't really been close. The thing is, when White is on the field, he's not necessarily seeing the ball. And when Bucky Irving is on the field, he's seeing the ball. They are making a point to get the ball in his hands. Todd Bowles said once again this week they want to see more of Bucky Irving. Last week, White was on the field for 42 snaps compared to just 18 for Irving, but White only had 11 touches on those 42 snaps, whereas Irving touched the ball 12 times on just 18 snaps. Now, White could still win the snap share. I'm not saying that won't happen, but when Irving is out there, again, they make a point to get him involved. And of the 51 qualified ball carriers in the NFL right now, White ranks ahead of only DeAndre Swift in terms of yards per attempt at 2.1. His 35% success rate is among the lowest of any back in the NFL. He's still providing you some value as a receiver, sure, but we have to consider that 75 of his 98 receiving yards on the year came in week 1 against a terrible Washington Commanders defense. Since then, he has only 6 catches for 23 yards over the last 2 games. The Bucs absolutely need to get their running game going if they want to be a playoff team this season. I think this could be the turning point in that backfield. I think going forward, we're going to view Bucky Irving as the back to roster in Tampa Bay. All right, next up, we're going to a quarterback here. Justin Fields finishes the week as a top 5 fantasy quarterback. So hear me out here. For one, the bar isn't so high this season. I mean, a 20 to 25 point week probably gets you there. Passing yardage is down. Passing touchdowns are way down. A lot of the non-mobile quarterbacks are finding themselves, in that QB 10 to QB 15 range every week. So we're not even asking all that much of Justin Fields. And obviously Fields has the rushing ability that helps him out a ton and gives him that high fantasy floor. This might be the best matchup of the season so far for Justin Fields. The Colts defense gave up over 350 passing yards to Caleb Williams last week. He hadn't come close to that number through the first 2 weeks of the season. They gave up a ton of rushing yards to both the Texans and the Packers in weeks 1 and 2. This is not a good defense. I know it maybe looked like a decent defense last week against Chicago. This is not a good unit, and I think they'll really struggle to contain a mobile quarterback this week in Justin Fields. Steelers, for their part, they're starting to trust Justin Fields a little bit more. They're doing things like, allowing him to throw the ball over the middle of the field, which he did not do at all in week 1. He's only turned the ball over 1 time so far through 3 games. He started to take a few more deep shots. We saw him hit some big plays last week. He's taken a few deep shots per game to George Pickens. Those are going to start to convert at a higher rate. I think this is a great spot for Justin Fields to have a splash week against that Indy defense. I think he rushes for at least 50 yards. I think he finds his way into the end zone on the ground. And keep in mind, Fields put up 19.4 fantasy points last week, despite running only 6 times for 6 yards. All right, our final bold prediction of the week. We're sticking with a quarterback here. CJ Stroud finishes as the QB1 in fantasy this week. It's going to be tough to unseat Josh Allen. He's been the QB1 in 2 of 3 weeks so far, but relatively tough matchup for him on the road at Baltimore. Stroud and the Texans, they're off to a relatively pedestrian start. If you took CJ Stroud as, say, the QB5 in your league, you're not thrilled with that so far. He's the QB16 on the season. He hasn't finished higher than QB8 in any week so far. That was week 1. We'll say that changes this week, to say the least, against a sad sack of a franchise that is the Jacksonville Jaguars. The Jags got completely embarrassed on national television last week against Buffalo, and they can say all the right things. They can say they want to make changes. They can say that, we'll be better next week. At some point, we need to see it in practice. And this is not a team that has responded well to adversity over the last couple of years. I don't like this matchup whatsoever for Jacksonville. The one thing that this team can hang its hat on is it's been a pretty solid run defense so far. Not sure if Joe Mixon will be back in the mix for the Texans this week. Not sure that really matters. I think the way to beat Jacksonville, the way to really beat them up the way the Bills did on Monday night, is to target that secondary. And this pass defense has been brutal so far. They don't generate pressure. They have only 5 sacks on the year. They're 28th in the NFL in terms of sack rate, allowed 6 touchdowns in 8 red zone trips so far this year. They're the only defense in the NFL that's yet to force a turnover on the season. And they have injuries as well. They lost their slot cornerback last week, Jerry Jones. Foye Oluokun, their only good linebacker, he's going to miss some time. Tyson Campbell, their best cornerback, he's on IR. I think the Jags, maybe they can get their act together on offense and hang around in this game, but I think this is a brutal matchup for them defensively. And the closer the Jags can make this game, the better. The more passing we're going to see from the Houston Texans in the second half of this game. Jacksonville 29th in pass defense EPA this season, giving up 8 pass yards per attempt, 29th in the NFL in yards per game allowed. I love Nico Collins this week. I love Stephon Diggs. It's hard not to like Tank Dell as well. I think this is a huge spot for CJ Stroud. We're looking at a 30-plus fantasy point week for him.